Okay, great. So welcome to our very first UX Jam session, user experience on the book, The User Experience Team of One. This is kind of intended to be both like a book club where we can discuss this book and its themes and some of the things that we've read in there, as well as just to, talk about our own experiences and how they might relate either to the themes in this book or just in general. So let me just start by asking how many people are actually able to read the book. If you can do the little emoji hand up or something. Not actually tell.
Maybe leaning heavy on you for that recap.
Yes. Okay. Good to know. That's okay. We very specifically said that it's okay for you guys to not have read the book. So we're gonna have that quick summary, get some initial thoughts, and then dive in, and then we're gonna kind of dive into some of the sections that I felt were important. And then we'll open up the discussion for questions and comments, etc. Yeah, and then at the end, this would not be a UX discussion if there wasn't a survey at the end of it. Emily will go and share in the chat a survey for you to fill out about this, about the experience of this jam session, so we can kind of get ideas of what we did great, what didn't work, and also what books you might want to read or have me report for you next session. Great. So with that in mind, okay. Where is this? Sorry. Anyways, this book was written by Leah Buley. Who is she and why is she? Why did she write this book? So she's a research and designer based in California who has over 20 years of experience in UX. She's known for previously being the director of design at Envision, and previously at Adaptive Path, which is a pioneering UX consultancy. You can find her at some of these links. The links will be accessible when the slides are released after the talk, but essentially what's in these links are kind of talks on hunches, instincts, and trusting your gut, which was a really interesting talk that covers a lot of her work with companies, kind of taking feedback and trusting your designs. And the next one is the New Frontier of Design Maturity, which is from 2019 and during her time at Envision, but it kind of helps get an idea of like where your company might be as far as like UX maturity and stuff like that. And the SoundCloud link goes to a 3-part series discussing UX and future frontiers. This one was also from 2018. I haven't found anything more recent that she's done, but I felt that this kind of gives a little bit more information in case you're interested more in her perspectives and experiences. That's where you can find her. So the book we're reading is The User Experience Team of One. The work Leah did at Adaptive Path was used as an experience designer is kind of the basis for the techniques in UX that led to this book. It was published in 2013, so this book hasn't been released with later editions since. So the book does have a few items that might feel a little bit dated 10 years later, as you can imagine. But I think it's still entirely relevant today to new and practiced UXers. The book is published by Rosenfeld Media, which seems to kind of only publish UX books. So you should really check into them if you want to flesh out your reading this summer. The book, let's see, next slide. So why this book? I was interested in using this book for our inaugural jam session because, well, mainly it's something that I've seen on a lot of UX book lists, which makes it really worth checking out. It's also not just an intro to UX book and can speak to both newbies as well as seasoned professionals, because I think that working as a team of one is a really common experience to a lot of designers at both new and senior levels. And I will say I am biased with that opinion because the majority of my UX career has been either the sole designer or sole UX focused individual. UX is a really collaborative field. You're kind of supposed to talk and work with others and especially other designers. So joining a company without a mentor or having a manager who doesn't have the same background, or having people on your team who aren't designers nor are familiar with UX practices, it can be really isolating. And I think combined with a lot more remote work that's happening in the industry these days, I think it's really important to prepare yourself and have that guidance. And so this book, I think, can really help you both figure out new ways to go and work as a singular person, and as well kind of get your coworkers interested and involved, so that way you don't feel quite so alone as you're in charge of your responsibilities. So what's in the book? It's helpful for people who are new to UX. It explains kind of what the career should look like. And what I mean by should look like is, kind of best practices. And it kind of discusses as well, like, roadblocks to this ideal. So part 1 deep dives into the many artifacts that are involved in the UX process. Part 2 gives lots of helpful methodologies for doing those quick, low cost or low investment research methods within an organization. You've got sections for planning and discovery, research methods for new and existing applications, various design methods, and your testing and validation. So for the last point, let's see, it's kind of the start of this, like, the beginnings of democratization of research, which might be a phrase that you've heard a lot more recently, because it's kind of the idea of democratization of research is to help involve your other coworkers into conducting research with you. You have your marketing team and your customer service teams who all have touch points with your users, and working with them can kind of help bring together that research that maybe you can't do all necessarily on your own, or even your UX team. So these days, there's a lot of pros and cons to that concept of democratization of research, and we're not going to go too deeply into it, but it's really interesting to kind of see the foundations of it covered in the book, especially as it talks about how to bring in your coworkers. So next. So before we get into the discussion portion, I'd like to just highlight a few parts of the book for those of you who haven't had a chance to read it, or a refresher if you've read it a long time ago. So kind of whether you're a mature UX company or not, I bet that your organization may have issues with departments being siloed off from each other. I think these 2 sections kind of are great for preparing you for what to look for. Hang on. Yeah. So we start off with the get to know the UX toolkit. UX is obviously more than research, design, and iterate. It contains kind of a list of activities that may take place in the UX process. One of the important things is that it talks about strategy and kind of getting started with what you're going to be designing or researching, etc. I find that strategy isn't really discussed that much in boot camps. Though it's been a few years since I've done a boot camp, but so I found that it was really interesting that there is a lot of information on, doing, like, there was a bit of the SWOT analysis, but also storyboarding, things of that nature. There's also implementation methods about, like, working with your engineering team, QAing your designs, etc., and kind of that responsibility that you have, where it's not like just you design it and then hand it off and then other people go ham on it. You should be involved with that implementation process and making sure that things don't fall to the side, or if they do, that you kind of need to understand why these weren't able to be implemented, and whether that was an issue with your designs, with like your stakeholders, or like the business like not having enough time for the engineers to implement them. And then that way, when you do your next iterations, you can either include those or think about how to design things a little bit more leanly. And then, of course, also it talks about your metrics and analytics tracking, which is a really important part of collecting data on what your users are doing now that your designs are live. So I thought that was a really great part for them to cover. Also, There's a section on dealing with people issues and dealing with organization issues. So these two sections, and they're in chapter 3, building support for your work. I think it's really important for kind of like establishing that rapport with your team internally and looking at the company processes as a whole. And so what I kind of mean by that is understanding kind of like where there might be business resistance. We might hear like, oh, there's just not enough budget and things of that nature. And then as well with people issues, you know, people who just don't people who don't understand what you're doing and why you're doing it. And so it's kind of like helping them to understand that it's not just about like your designs as well. It can help them with their understanding of like what people are trying to do, what, you know, what problems you're trying to solve for them, so that you kind of all get to work together. And then there's also a kind of like, just what do you want to see for their UX maturity? And what do your team members want to see? Like maybe your team members just do not give a damn about UX and they're like, just, this is your thing and I don't want to hear about it. But those are kind of important discussions to have with your team of like, how involved do you want to be with my stuff? How involved can I allow you to be with my stuff before it becomes too many chefs in the kitchen or something like that? And how to kind of establish those boundaries when people are maybe encroaching a little bit too much in it. And then of course, thinking about what does your business need? Because we're told to focus on our users, and yes, that's important, but your business needs are going to inform what you're allowed to do with and for your users. So once you kind of understand that whole ecosystem, it can help you be more effective in making your requests for things like doing research, or being able to talk to clients and stakeholders who you're doing the work for. And then lastly, there's a great section on kind of growing yourself in your career. It is, of course, a little bit dated. There are so many more Slack groups and everything around right now. There's us, of course. The Women Who Code Network is a fantastic network. There's also kind of more formal and academic ones like Sig Chi, and kind of the AMC, like group of engineers and people who do kind of more human computer interaction based groups. There's AGA as well, which tends to be thought of as more of the design community and more art based, but there are a lot of UX people. And so it's kind of good to get that mix. And then you can start figuring out like, hey, do I want to be more on like this side or that side? And you'll find your people. And it's really important to have these groups to kind of help you let you vent to them, take their reins, all of that sort of stuff. As well, they discuss various conferences that are around the world, especially the really big ones. I'm wearing a t-shirt for one of my favorite ones called Beyond Tellerrand, which is a smaller kind of web-based conference out in Berlin. And if you happen to be able to get out there, I highly recommend it. It's the most fun design conference I've had in a while. In any case, yeah, things like continuing education, how to plan for your career growth, like things about like what is your roadmap? Like, do you want to go into more management? Do you eventually want to go into like product and owning that sort of thing? You know, or do you want to go more towards UX research and less on the design side? And then of course there's the really hard questions like, is the company actually right for you? And kind of ways to evaluate, are they meeting your needs? Is it right for you to continue with this company? Are they ever going to allow you to do the work that you need to be doing as a UX person? Or should you maybe start looking for a new job? And little bits about freelancing and kind of being on your own. So it's a whole bunch for just like 5 chapters. In part 2, this is the more fun one where they really are going into different methodologies. And so they're split up into these different sections. So I only touched on a few bits of them, just because it's my opinion. But so in planning and discovering methods, they talked about, there's 3 ones that kind of stood out to me from the methods that they suggested. One of which is the listening tour, which is talking to your colleagues in your team and on other teams, which I think is really important because a lot of companies do have these issues where all these different departments are really siloed off and they're all, you know, masters of their domain, but if they're not cross communicating, then you can't really know how the problems in one section is affecting the others. And UX really helps you look at kind of everything as an ecosystem. It's not just about like what's on the website, but also what's going on with your coworkers in the background. So you can kind of help, like you can learn about like known issues, their values, like even their specific UX values that they're implementing, even if they don't have UX in their name. And then that'll also help you understand kind of who's open to working with you. Especially if you need to get internal user testers who are people that might, really enjoy spending 5 to 10 minutes walking through a prototype with you and, testing things out, or, who might have a really interesting perspective or anything like that. Because you don't want to just, corner someone and be like, well, hey, I know there's, XYZ about you. And so I need you to test my prototype. It's the wrong way to try and like address getting different opinions. They also mentioned project briefs, which is kind of always important, even if it's only for yourself to stay on task. This is the idea of kind of pulling all of your data and information at the beginning and putting it into a document. And it's not just about like what your stakeholders want. It can be different values that you get from interviews, like finding pain points and finding those points of opportunity. You kind of collect them all into a brief and then kind of use that as your guiding light to make sure that you're addressing all of these issues. Or if you're not able to address the ones from your brief, why not? And I think that always, like, as you go through projects, you'll find that sometimes your managers, your stakeholders, et cetera, will be like, well, we're just not going to address that. And I think it's really important to ask them why. Even though it might feel like you're pushing back on them, it's not necessarily that. It's that way you can understand, is this something that we have an opportunity to work on in a later version? Is it that there's not enough funding to cover it? And could you do the work to find like a leaner way to get around that? Or is it just like they literally do not care about whatever this is? And that way you just, and again, you can address it, you can push back against it, you can save it for later. But all of this planning is really important. And then the last one is the workshops and brainstorm sessions. So kind of like your colleagues understand the product and they have ideas of like how they would want to improve it, because sometimes they're the ones who are dealing with a lot of these different sections, whether it's like, checkout and customer service, or even just like, contact forms, stuff like that. So I think that it's important to get their opinions on things, but also you need to make sure that you have like time and space for running these brainstorm sessions. Does it need to happen for every single feature? Because again, you have that thing of everyone has great knowledge and great ideas, but if it's too many chefs, then they're just going to start dumping on you, essentially. And so you got to just find which of these methods are necessary on your path. So as we get into the research methods, we have the heuristic markup, which if you haven't heard about it, there's usually there's a few different kinds of heuristic methodologies that you can do. And it's generally should be done with two designers. If you go through this checklist, as you go through an existing website and see if they kind of meet these different ideas for usability. But when you're a team of one, sometimes it's just going to be you. And you're going to miss things, or you're going to maybe like overestimate how bad of a usability issue this is. And that's fine. But it's a really good practice, especially when you're starting a new job or project, to go and do this analysis of the existing project. It also means that you're going to go through every single page of that site, and it'll help you learn the product faster, and it'll help kind of point out like different issues. And even if it's not something that you can address, you can store it for later. And then maybe you'll start getting like the customer data from like analytics and be like, oh, I thought that this wasn't very usable, and look at how long it takes people to fill out this section of a form or something like that. So that's where these kind of heuristic analyses can help. They mentioned making proto personas, which I say no. I just, there's a lot of people who have different opinions about personas, but for me, I don't think that you should ever persona without research to back it up. Like, these personas should be built on interviews or data that you've collected, have some kind of foundation. Otherwise, you're just essentially, you're codifying assumptions that you're making about people. And you don't want to do that because, well, that's not what we're about. But also, yeah, we want to make things as accurate to our users' needs. So if we just assume, oh, everyone hates this, or nobody wants to do this, then we might be missing something as we're working on our designs. And then the last thing was, there's a section on content patterns, which is too big to go over in this, but it was essentially kind of marking down every aspect, kind of like how this form works, how these buttons work, all of that stuff. It's very long and tedious, but it gives you kind of a more in-depth than like just creating like an information architecture, like a sitemap or anything like that, because you're really understanding what is everything on the page. And I thought that was really fascinating as a way to start mapping out an application that you're coming into. And to, again, further help you understand what is there, what's going on, how did they set these things up. If you're working, especially on like an older legacy application, you might start seeing issues with like your design system patterns, or maybe the lack thereof of a design system, and how suddenly everything is no longer, one button works one way, one tooltip, you click on it, another one you hover on it, and you can start seeing all of these different issues and figuring out ways of how you can do those kind of like low-hanging fruits of UX improvements. So the third section
Melissa,
was design.
before we move on to design methods, we had a question in the chat, also some feedback about also enjoying personas, but the necessity of them being backed by data. But the question from Daniela was, in I think response to proto personas, is this the new normal, like saying no to proto personas? Or maybe if you could provide a little more insight on what personas are and what they're used for.
So in general, there's personas, which usually are assumed to be backed by data. They're supposed to be collecting, you kind of make up the name and personify a user type of your application. And so it'll be like, this is Melissa. She's in her late 30s, and she's really interested in tech and all of these things, and kind of how that would apply to, say, a grocery store application. As a tech user, I'm going to be more likely to go and use those things. And so when you kind of do it as the proto persona, that's just you essentially it's making assumptions of like, oh, because it's a woman of a certain age in a certain industry, she's going to be more likely or less likely to have these kinds of issues. And so that's when you get into, and that's when you start like putting in your biases. And that's why I personally say no to proto personas, because you can then be like, oh, well, this persona is for a 60-year-old woman, and so obviously she doesn't know how to use tech. And that might not be who your users are. Like maybe there is an industry or maybe an application where the majority of their users are like that, but you won't know that unless you actually have the data behind to back it up. And that's usually through surveys, through user interviews, etc. And so if you're not using that, then you're going through a false assumption. And so that's why I don't like proto personas, but they do talk about them in this book and why you might want to go through them. And then that's kind of up to you if you want to move forward with them or not. And like in your company, you'll also see if you even have time to go and make personas. Some companies think that it's not very useful. A lot of other companies do think that they're useful because it helps, like, it gives a face, it does the empathy thing, where, you can start to understand what their problems are because it's written in the persona, and kind of keep those pain points in mind and be like, okay, well, I want to design for this person and address those issues. And that's why that's when they're helpful. But again, if you're just doing this based on made up people, then you can run into issues unless you really, really, really have a lot of experience, but with some kind of user type. But even then, I would say don't assume that you know 100% what people are going to be like.
Awesome. Thank you for the clarification.
Okay, so for the design methods, they start off with the design brief, design principles. And so this is different from that project brief where it's more on the look and feel of things. It's your fun like Pinterest board of, hey, these are colors, these are images, this is the language, this is the voice that we want our copy to have. This is, it's getting all the more fun stuff together as opposed to the formal business items together. We have a sketch board, which was really interesting because it was kind of a combination of like a journey map and brainstorm where you put up the wireframes and then let people kind of come around with different stickies and put their ideas around it. And then there was a section on hand-drawn screens, and I'm never sure how to feel about that. And so that's why I kind of wanted to bring it into this discussion. Do people enjoy doing hand-drawn screens? For me, if I'm generally in like early stages with no visual, like no design system, no visual library, I like to do hand drawing. I think it helps me get out of my head a little bit, especially when things are more amorphous. It's easier to just be like, form fields, box. But with a more like mature application, if it already has a design system, I just go and use that library and start dropping things out. Because for one, they tend to be a little bit more strict about, making customizations essentially, and making like new patterns and new designs for things. So I like to work within the constraints of what can be used. And it's also just pretty quick of like, I'm just going to text some things together and I can ship it off to an engineer and not have to hand draw it and then formally draw it. But I don't know if anyone else has opinions on hand drawing or not. But yeah, there's a whole nice section about that. Anywho. Highlights part two. These are the last two sections. So soon we'll have covered the entire book. They mentioned design methods, which is different from the wireframing design. Wait. Actually, sorry. I'm missing a section because that was design methods. I don't know what happened. We're going to ignore this part. Just stick to testing and validation methods. My apologies for losing a section. Anywho, for testing and validation methods, they mentioned something called a black hat session, which was based on this kind of like this philosophy of 6 hats where like, you wear different hats and that represents kind of a different emotional type of like, trying to be really positive about something, being really negative about things, skepticism, etc. So with the black hat session, everyone's wearing their black hat and you're using your coworkers to essentially point out the hard things and critique your designs and flows, but not directly to you. It's usually we'll put things up and then we'll let people go and put stickies where they can go and say, here's where I'm confused, here's where I'm having problems. And, they can go and critique the design, but you want to kind of push them towards like, hey, does do the elements on here make sense? Do you understand what you're supposed to be doing? And then this way, they're not talking directly to you as the designer. They're not able to make things be a conversation. They can just write a note, stick it on there, you can synthesize it afterwards and then address the issues. And if you want to, you can maybe follow up with someone and be like, I don't understand what this meant, or not. But I thought that that was a really interesting kind of validation method for yourself before you even start making something into a prototype. There was the quick and dirty usability test, which is you just give a task to accomplish with your design and just watch how the user does. And this you can usually do with any one of your coworkers. It might be good to kind of establish who is familiar with your system and who is not, because someone who maybe goes through it every single day with their customers, or even might be a customer themselves, are going to have different responses than someone who's maybe seeing this for the first time. But again, like, if you're working in something a little bit specialized, like, hey, fill out this legal document. People might get confused just because they don't have that background in what they should be putting in there. Though it can also give you a little bit of like information of, hey, here's where you might want to define something a little bit better. The idea of this is to kind of keep it to 5-minute tasks, so you're also not stealing all of your coworkers' time and making them late for their things. The last one is the UX health check, where you actually build a team of invested colleagues to be the team that kind of reviews the finished product at regular intervals. And this is like your live site, you have it on there, and you can do this on a monthly basis or a quarterly basis or even just a yearly basis. But it's all of you together invested in this. You want to set kind of benchmarks and targets, whether it's, about filling things out quickly, or, how often you might want to come back to check on things, etc. But each member measures and kind of discusses their rankings for each of the pages or each of the workflows that are in your application, and you work together to kind of find those opportunities and priorities. And so that was really interesting. I do think that it might be a little bit hard to do, but you also might be surprised, like who would be interested in that, because obviously engineering would have, one point of view for how the site should be functioning, whether it's, how like speed tests and stuff like that. But also, again, your marketing people would have different opinions. And so you kind of have to take those rankings and discuss it together of like, and try and help them with that. Like, hey, let's think about this from the user point of view. Like, what do we want the user to be able to do? And yeah. And so those were pretty much all of the different sections that we had. And after those sections, there is a full appendix that just outlines every single methodology. It's really great, and a very quick reference. So this book has been mostly a reference book. It's a little bit of a philosophical book, but mostly it talks about methods. And so, yeah, this book is helpful for people who are new to UX and kind of explains what the career should look like and kind of the roadblocks. It's not always the case that you'll have access to users for your research. So it talks to you about how to use your coworkers as user testers. And also you might be the sole UX person in the company. So it will help you talk to other people and either kind of get them up to speed and get them invested in the UX of the site, and possibly help you with your research. It also gives lots of helpful methodologies for doing quick, low cost or low investment research methods within the organization. That's kind of the most important part, is that most of this is just going to take time. But a lot of it, you don't have to pay for really fancy tools. You won't have to pay for participants because it's going to be your coworkers. And you won't have to deal with kind of the potential legal issues that can come from offering incentives for doing user testing, which is a whole other conversation. In any case, so it also covers many artifacts you can create besides your UIs, like your storyboards, your roadmaps, your specifications, like red lines, which is when you create your wireframes and have like notation tags that you would go and give to engineers to let them know how things should function if it's not obvious within the designs or prototypes. some of the negatives of it is that it is from 2013, so it's mostly focused on in-person methods, with fewer tools and methods for remote research or collaborative work. So a lot of it is like, just go like down the hall and tap someone's shoulder, which is not something that a lot of us can do these days, myself especially. All of my coworkers are in other parts of the country. It is also very light on accessibility research and how to address that in a team of one, which can be a really big blind spot. So it would also be helpful if they did discuss those incentives and how to kind of build a lean budget where you could potentially pay people, a little bit, or try and find the funds, or just even get an idea of how to go and build a budget request, for even just like the minimum amount of users that you do. Because for a lot of research usability testing, you only need maybe like 3 to 5 people. And so if you're only paying 3 to 5 people, $25 gift card, you can get a really high rate of return for that small investment. And so if you can understand how you would build that budget, like what tools you can use to go and get those gift cards, maybe ways to get those things in bulk. And then of course, the kind of like issues of when it would be inappropriate to pay someone for doing research, things like if it's for health information, stuff like that. None of that was discussed in here. And I think that's a really important thing, especially when you want to talk about doing research on a lean budget. It focuses on methodologies in interviewing your colleagues, but it doesn't discuss too much about stakeholder conversations. And that was kind of a point because I worked for a company for a while where we would be building applications for our clients who came to us, and then there were bosses and managers, and then this application was going to be used by their employees underneath them. And so I wasn't allowed to talk to any of their employees, but I could talk to the manager, and that person possibly they came up through the company, so they would have been using this software before, and maybe this is like their project, and that's why we're building it. Or, I can even just ask them questions and be like, well, how long does it take people to do something normally? What's this experience like? And if they're just like, oh, I don't actually even know, you can maybe convince them like, hey, can you just like send me maybe ask somebody and send me an email? But you can't do that if you don't get that face-to-face. If you just get like, hey, my boss just gave me a project brief and was like, get to designing. So little ways to maybe slip into different conversations, and do a little bit more background work. It also doesn't go very deep into stakeholder deliverables, which is when you present your research, when you present some of your items to kind of show what you did and how that helped, that whole return on investment aspect. I think that learning a little bit more about how to make those presentations would definitely help, and can also help for maybe eventually not being just a team of one. It can help them understand why you need more help with people, why taking the time to do these things is important, etc. And then kind of just a small section on working as a solo designer with like helpful suggestions for networking. It has that, but it doesn't really kind of cover the impacts of the experience, which is what I'd mentioned at kind of the beginning of this, where working on your own is a little isolating. It's very confusing if you don't have a mentor to tell you like, hey, this is good, this is bad, or like what you should be doing. And so while they talked about, hey, these are different places where you can find other people, I think it just doesn't go into like why also you maybe just wouldn't want to work for a company where that you're going to be the sole UX person, or how to prepare yourself for being the sole UX person on a team. So those were my critiques. And yeah, so that is pretty much everything on the book. So let's get into a discussion about either what we've talked about here so far. If you've read the book, then I have questions here where maybe we can kind of just like, if you have questions for me, please drop them into the chat, or unmute and we can figure out how to shout them out. Or you can start with any one of these questions. Let's get started.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for the overview, Melissa. Had some feedback in the chat that it sounds like a great reference book. You got some believers.
Mhm.
So with that, I'm going to stop the recording since we're opening up our discussion now.